You are in the wrong place, sweetheart. The staff entrance is around the back. Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the ballroom before Naomi Brooks had taken her third step inside. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across polished marble. A string quartet faltered for a heartbeat. Then scattered laughter rolled through the room. Naomi stopped without lifting her chin. The worn navy jacket on her shoulders carried no shine, only careful stitching over years of quiet service. The ribbons above her heart looked faded beneath the golden lights, almost invisible against the fabric. A young waiter glanced at her with sympathy before lowering his eyes. Richard smirked, swirling amber bourbon in a crystal glass. This reception is for decorated veterans. He looked her up and down. Not for people pretending to be one. More laughter. Camera shutters clicked from the press line near the stage. Naomi felt the warmth of hundreds of curious eyes, but her breathing never changed. Slow in. Slow out. The same rhythm that had carried her through nights filled with helicopter blades, smoke, and radio static years before. She quietly reached into her purse and produced an invitation with neatly folded edges. Richard barely looked at it. Counterfeit invitations are getting better every year. He handed it back with 2 fingers as though it carried dust. A security officer shifted uncomfortably beside the entrance. Sir, Richard interrupted him. Escort her outside before our guests start asking questions. The officer hesitated. Naomi noticed the hesitation. She also noticed the American flag standing beside the stage. Its fabric barely moved beneath the steady flow of conditioned air. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a military band rehearsed a slow brass cadence. The sound drifted through the hallway like a distant memory. Naomi swallowed once. Not because of embarrassment. Because that melody belonged to friends who never came home. A little boy standing beside his grandfather tugged gently on an old army sleeve. Grandpa, he whispered, why is everyone laughing at her? The elderly veteran stared at Naomi longer than anyone else. His weathered eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth as if searching for a memory that refused to arrive. Richard stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. Last chance. Leave with dignity. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time. Her voice remained calm. I already have my dignity. The answer landed softly, yet the silence afterwards somehow grew louder than the orchestra. Richard laughed again, louder this time, inviting everyone else to follow. Glasses clinked. Someone muttered that she probably bought the jacket from a surplus store. Another guest quietly recorded everything on a phone. Naomi did not react. Her fingers rested naturally against the seam of her trousers. Her shoulders settled. Her heels aligned. Without thinking, she stood in perfect military posture. The movement was so precise that the elderly veteran's expression suddenly changed. Confusion became recognition. Before he could speak, the massive ballroom doors opened with a deep metallic sound that echoed across the marble floor. Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned. Heavy footsteps approached with measured precision. The military band outside fell completely silent. Richard smiled confidently, assuming the arriving guest would congratulate him for protecting the ceremony. Naomi never turned around. She recognized those footsteps long before anyone announced a name. And somewhere behind her, a voice filled with disbelief quietly whispered, General Hayes, why is he walking toward her? The polished heels of General Daniel Hayes struck the marble floor with slow, unmistakable precision. Every step seemed louder than the last. Conversations dissolved into silence. Even the crystal glasses stopped clinking as hundreds of eyes followed him across the ballroom. Richard Whitmore straightened his tuxedo and forced a confident smile, already extending his hand. General Hayes. It is an honor to finally. The general walked straight past him without a glance. Richard's hand remained suspended in the air as whispers rippled through the crowd. Naomi did not move. She kept her shoulders square, her eyes fixed ahead, her breathing steady. The faint scent of brass polish drifted in from the military band waiting outside, mixing with expensive cologne and fresh-cut lilies. General Hayes stopped exactly one pace in front of her. His weathered face remained unreadable. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Richard laughed awkwardly. General, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. She wandered into a private event. No response. Hayes studied Naomi for another long second, his blue eyes searching hers as though measuring decades instead of moments. Naomi recognized the scar near his temple. It had once been hidden beneath blood and desert dust. Her fingers tightened almost invisibly along the seam of her jacket. "Sir?" she said quietly. It was the first word she had spoken to him in years. A flicker crossed the general's face. Relief. Gratitude. Something deeper. Around them, reporters raised cameras, expecting another awkward exchange. Instead, General Hayes slowly removed his white dress gloves. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. An elderly veteran near the front row suddenly stood without realizing it. Then another followed. The room sensed that something important was unfolding, but no one understood what. Richard cleared his throat. "General, security was simply protecting the integrity of the ceremony." Hayes finally turned his head. The look he gave Richard was calm, yet it drained every ounce of confidence from the wealthy donor's face. "Integrity?" the general asked softly. The single word landed harder than a shout. Richard swallowed. "We verify credentials." Hayes looked back at Naomi. "Did you show them your invitation?" "Yes, sir." "Did anyone ask your name?" Naomi hesitated. "No, sir." A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. Somewhere near the stage, a photographer slowly lowered his camera. Hayes nodded once, almost to himself. "That is unfortunate." Richard forced another smile. "General, if there has been an inconvenience, we can arrange seating." Naomi expected the conversation to end there. She had learned long ago that quiet dignity often survived where arguments failed. But Hayes did not move toward the stage. Instead, he looked directly at the rows of decorated veterans filling the ballroom. "How many of you served overseas?" Hands slowly rose throughout the room. "Then you know what trust looks like." His voice never rose, yet every corner of the ballroom heard him. "Sometimes the soldier who saves your life is the one nobody notices." Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time. The memories returned without warning. Sand whipping across broken vehicles. The smell of fuel. A radio crackling through smoke. Someone shouting for a medic. She pushed the memories back before they reached her face. Richard noticed the change. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. "General, who exactly is she?" Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached inside the pocket of his dress uniform and slowly unfolded a weathered photograph with creased edges. He stared at it for one quiet moment before turning it toward the stunned crowd. The image showed a much younger soldier carrying a wounded officer through a cloud of dust. Then Hayes looked at Naomi, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, do you still have the medal you refused to accept that day?" Naomi's eyes settled on the faded photograph without reaching for it. The ballroom remained so quiet that the faint hum of the air vents sounded almost mechanical. Camera phones slowly lifted throughout the crowd. Tiny red recording lights blinked like distant stars. Richard Whitmore folded his arms, trying to recover the confidence that had slipped from him moments earlier. "General, with all due respect, memories do not replace documentation." His voice was steady, but a bead of sweat traced the edge of his collar. Naomi finally answered. "No, sir." Her words surprised everyone. Even General Hayes blinked. "I do not have the medal." A ripple of whispers swept across the room. Richard smiled again. "There it is." He looked toward the reporters. "A remarkable story without a single piece of proof." Several guests nodded, relieved that the tension finally seemed to have an ordinary explanation. Naomi lowered her gaze to the polished marble beneath her shoes. The reflection of the chandeliers shimmered across the floor like water. "I turned it down," she said quietly. The whispers stopped. Hayes never looked away from her. "Tell them why." Naomi hesitated. Her fingers brushed the frayed cuff of her old jacket. "There were 3 medics on that mission," 2 never came home. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. The citation named only me. I could not wear a medal that belonged to all of us. Silence spread through the ballroom again, heavier this time. The elderly veteran in the front row slowly removed his own cap. A young reporter lowered her camera, suddenly unsure whether filming felt appropriate. Richard cleared his throat. That is a touching story, but anyone can say that. Hayes turned sharply toward him. Anyone? The general's voice was still controlled, yet the room seemed to shrink around it. Richard forced a smile. We simply have standards. Hayes nodded once. So do I. He carefully unfolded the old photograph again. On the back, faded handwriting covered the paper. He handed it to Richard. Read the last line. Richard accepted it with visible reluctance. His eyes scanned the page. The color slowly drained from his face. His lips parted, but no words came out. Read it, Hayes repeated. Richard swallowed. If I do not make it back, recommend Sergeant Naomi Brooks instead, she saved us all. The sentence barely escaped his mouth. A murmur rolled through the ballroom. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Captain Michael Donovan. The officer who had insisted on writing letters for every family before the mission began. The officer who never returned. Hayes spoke softly. He wrote that less than an hour before the convoy was hit. Richard stared at the photograph as though hoping the ink would change. This could still be. He stopped himself. The argument no longer sounded convincing, even to him. Naomi looked toward the American flag beside the stage. The brass band outside began warming up again, a slow trumpet note drifting through the hallway. It sounded almost like a farewell. Then another voice interrupted from the back of the ballroom. General Hayes. Captain Luis Ramirez stepped forward carrying a sealed military archive folder against his chest. His expression was tense. The records office finally located the classified file you requested. Every head turned toward the thick folder marked with a red government seal. Hayes accepted it carefully but did not open it. Instead, he looked directly at Naomi. Some truths, he said quietly, were never allowed to be told. Naomi's steady expression finally changed. For the first time that evening, genuine surprise crossed her face as Hayes broke the seal and saw the first page. The crackle of the broken security seal echoed through the silent ballroom as General Hayes turned the first page. The cold white lights above reflected across the metal clips of the classified folder, flashing like tiny warning signals. No one spoke. Even the reporters holding up their phones seemed afraid to breathe. Richard Whitmore leaned forward, forcing a confident smile that no longer reached his eyes. General, classified records can be misunderstood out of context. His voice carried across the room, but the edge of certainty had disappeared. Hayes ignored him. His eyes moved slowly down the page. The muscles in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Ramirez shifted his weight beside him, gripping his dress cap so firmly that his knuckles turned pale. Naomi watched the general instead of the file. Something in his expression told her he had just found the page he had been searching for all these years. A low murmur spread through the ballroom like distant thunder. Richard stepped closer. May I see that document? Hayes closed the folder halfway without looking up. No. The answer landed with quiet force. Camera shutters erupted again. Tiny flashes reflected off polished metals, crystal glasses, and brass fixtures around the stage. Richard's breathing became shallower. Every headline he imagined tomorrow seemed worse than the last. This ceremony has donors, sponsors, elected officials, he said. We cannot allow one emotional story to overshadow the event. Naomi finally looked at him. Her voice remained calm. This was never my story. Richard scoffed. Then whose is it? Before Naomi could answer, Hayes slowly reopened the folder. The Army investigated that convoy for 18 months, he said. Every review reached the same conclusion. He paused. Until today. The room stiffened. Naomi frowned. Today? Hayes nodded once. One report was never included in the official archive. Captain Ramirez carefully removed a sealed envelope tucked inside the folder. The paper had yellowed with age. Its edges were worn. A military evidence label still clung to the front. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. She had never seen the envelope before. Richard reached out instinctively. This is highly irregular. Hayes did not even acknowledge him. He slid one finger beneath the brittle seal and unfolded a handwritten statement. The paper trembled slightly, not from weakness but from age. Hayes read the opening lines silently before lifting his eyes toward Naomi. Do you remember the engine fire? The question struck her harder than anyone realized. The smell of burning diesel rushed back into her memory. Heat rolling across armored steel. Radio static. Smoke so thick it erased the horizon. She answered almost automatically. It was not an engine fire. Several veterans in the audience looked at one another. Hayes slowly nodded. That is exactly what this witness wrote. Richard frowned. Witness? Hayes raised the page. According to this statement, Sergeant Naomi Brooks warned command that the vehicle failure had been misidentified. Naomi's eyes widened. She remembered standing beside the disabled convoy, pointing toward a damaged hydraulic line while senior officers insisted the engine had failed. She remembered being ignored because she was the youngest medic on the scene. Richard laughed nervously. Even if that happened 20 years ago, it changes nothing. Hayes closed the folder again. It changes everything. The general's voice dropped lower. Because if Sergeant Brooks was right. He looked around the ballroom, meeting the eyes of decorated officers, politicians, reporters, and donors alike. Then the official report blamed the wrong cause. The whispering exploded. Reporters began speaking into microphones. Veterans exchanged stunned looks. Richard's face lost its color as the implications settled over him. Naomi stood perfectly still, unable to tear her eyes away from the sealed documents. Then Captain Ramirez quietly reached into the folder one final time and removed a small evidence bag. Inside rested a tarnished military medal that had clearly never been presented. Naomi's breathing caught. Hayes stared at the medal for a long moment before looking back at her. There is one more name attached to this evidence, he said softly. And I do not think anyone in this room is prepared to hear it. The tarnished medal lay inside the clear evidence pouch, catching the cold chandelier light like a forgotten promise. No one reached for a drink. No one whispered. The only sound came from dozens of phone cameras quietly recording every second. Richard Whitmore stared at the medal, his jaw tightening as investors along the front tables exchanged uneasy glances. General Hayes held the pouch carefully, then looked at Captain Ramirez. Read the attached record. Ramirez broke the brittle paper clip holding a single yellowed document to the evidence bag. His voice was steady at first. Evidence Item 47. Distinguished Service Medal. Presentation delayed pending classified review. He stopped. His eyes widened. Recipient. The room leaned forward together. Read it, Hayes said. Ramirez swallowed. Recipient recommendation amended by direct order. A murmur swept across the ballroom. Richard stepped in before the sentence could continue. General, enough. This ceremony is becoming a public spectacle. Hayes did not even acknowledge him. Finish reading. Ramirez looked back down. Original recipient. Sergeant Naomi Brooks. Naomi closed her eyes for the briefest moment. She had never expected to hear those words spoken aloud. Richard forced a strained laugh. Recommendations are not awards. They change all the time. Hayes nodded once. Keep reading. Ramirez inhaled slowly. Recommendation withdrawn after testimony from civilian consultant Richard Whitmore. Silence crashed over the ballroom. Richard's expression froze. Naomi slowly opened her eyes. Around the room, several veterans turned toward Richard with visible confusion. Reporters lowered their microphones, then immediately raised them again. Richard shook his head. That is impossible. I was never part of the military chain of command. Hayes answered quietly. No. But your defense company supplied the vehicles used in that convoy. Richard's breathing became noticeably faster. The polished ice in his untouched bourbon glass trembled as his hand brushed the table. That has nothing to do with this. Naomi finally spoke. The hydraulic failure. Every eye shifted toward her. The vehicles did not fail because of the engines, she continued. I told the investigation the hydraulic lines overheated after repeated field repairs. Hayes slowly nodded. She reported it before the convoy moved. Richard immediately interrupted. There was no proof. Naomi met his eyes without anger. There was proof. She paused. You refused to look. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. An elderly veteran quietly removed every medal from his jacket and placed them on the table, unable to look away. A television reporter whispered into her headset, her voice shaking. Keep every camera alive. Richard suddenly raised his voice. This is outrageous. One old document cannot rewrite 20 years of history. Hayes reached back into the folder. Fortunately, it is not one document. He withdrew another sealed packet, thicker than the first. The government seal remained intact. The archive contained maintenance photographs that were never released. Naomi frowned. She had never known photographs existed. Hayes handed the packet to Ramirez. Open it. The crack of the seal echoed through the silent ballroom. One glossy photograph slid onto the table. Then another. Then a third. Ramirez stopped breathing for a moment. The first image showed the damaged convoy exactly as Naomi remembered it. The second showed scorched hydraulic components. The third made the captain's hands tremble. Richard's face drained of color before anyone else had even seen it. No, he whispered instinctively. Hayes slowly lifted the final photograph so the front row could see it. Reflected in the twisted metal beside the damaged vehicle stood a man in a business suit, wearing a visitor badge with one unmistakable name printed beneath the company logo. Richard Whitmore. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing as Naomi stared at the photograph, realizing that the man who had humiliated her only minutes earlier had been standing at the scene of the disaster all along. No one reached for the photograph. It remained suspended in General Hayes's steady hand, the glossy surface reflecting the cold chandelier light like polished steel. The ballroom felt strangely hollow now. The whispers were gone. Even the constant clicking of phone cameras faded into scattered, uncertain taps. Richard Whitmore stared at the image as though refusing to recognize the younger version of himself frozen beside the damaged convoy. His breathing slowed, but not from calm. It was the strained rhythm of a man trying to regain control over a room that had already slipped away. Naomi never looked at him. Her attention stayed on the photograph. She remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. The smell of scorched hydraulic fluid. The heat rising from twisted armor. The metallic ticking of cooling machinery after the engines had finally gone silent. She had remembered those details every day for 2 decades, even when everyone else insisted the official report had settled the truth. General Hayes carefully lowered the photograph onto the table without another word. The soft sound of glossy paper against polished wood echoed farther than it should have. An older veteran stepped closer and studied the image. His brow tightened. Then another veteran joined him. One by one, decorated soldiers quietly approached, not speaking, only looking. The movement spread through the ballroom without instruction, like a silent formation assembling on instinct. Richard noticed it first. The room was no longer facing him. It was facing Naomi. His fingers tightened around the untouched bourbon glass until the ice cracked with a sharp pop. Several investors exchanged uneasy glances. A phone vibrated softly somewhere near the front row, but its owner ignored it. Captain Ramirez remained perfectly still beside Hayes, his eyes fixed on Naomi with something that had not been there before. Respect. Not because of the classified file. Because she had never once interrupted, defended herself, or demanded recognition. She had simply waited for the truth to arrive on its own. Hayes finally broke the silence. Sergeant Brooks. Naomi lifted her eyes. Sir? Why did you never appeal the findings? She answered almost immediately. Because the families needed peace more than another investigation. The words settled over the ballroom with quiet force. Several veterans lowered their heads. A reporter slowly set her microphone on the table, suddenly aware that no headline could compete with the weight of that answer. Richard looked around the room, searching for someone willing to stand beside him. No one did. His polished confidence had vanished, replaced by something far more fragile. You expect everyone to believe one memory over decades of official records? He asked, but the challenge sounded hollow now. Naomi finally turned toward him. There was no anger in her expression. Only exhaustion. No, she said softly. I expected no one to believe me. The sentence struck harder than any accusation. The silence afterward seemed to press against every wall of the ballroom. Hayes looked toward the folded American flag beside the stage. Truth has a strange habit, he murmured. It does not disappear. It waits. Another vibration broke the silence. This time it came from Captain Ramirez's uniform pocket. He glanced at the screen, and the color slowly left his face. Hayes noticed immediately. Captain? Ramirez hesitated before handing the phone over. Sir, the Defense Archives just called. Hayes read the message once. Then he read it again. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked at Naomi for a long moment before carefully locking the phone screen. The archive team found another sealed file, he said quietly. It was never listed with the convoy investigation. Richard's shoulders stiffened. Another file? Hayes nodded. It was opened exactly 1 hour ago. Naomi felt a chill despite the warm lights filling the ballroom. What is in it? She asked. Hayes did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the ballroom entrance as the heavy doors slowly opened once again. A lone military courier stepped inside carrying a weathered steel evidence case secured with 2 government locks, and every veteran in the room instinctively rose to their feet before anyone had spoken a single word. The steel evidence case landed on the table with a deep metallic thud that echoed across the silent ballroom. Every veteran remained standing. Every phone stayed pointed toward the stage. Under the cold white lights, the brushed metal surface reflected dozens of anxious faces, but Naomi Brooks did not look at the case. She looked at General Hayes. Somehow, she already knew what frightened him. The military courier removed a sealed authorization card from his jacket. Opened by order of the Department of Defense, he said quietly. Access restricted until General Hayes confirms the identity of Sergeant Naomi Brooks. Hayes nodded once. Confirmed. The second lock released with a sharp click. The sound cut through the room like a rifle bolt sliding into place. Richard Whitmore instinctively stepped backward. His polished shoes scraped against the marble floor. No one noticed. Captain Ramirez slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a stack of aging reports, a cracked field notebook, and a small silver recorder sealed inside a protective pouch. The recorder looked ordinary, almost insignificant, yet every eye in the ballroom fixed on it. Hayes carefully picked it up. I thought this had been destroyed. Naomi stared at the recorder without blinking. It belonged to Captain Donovan. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He recorded every mission briefing. Hayes looked at her. You remember? He said. Memory fades. Machines do not. A faint murmur passed through the veterans. Richard suddenly stepped forward, his composure cracking. Those recordings were never admitted as evidence. Hayes answered without taking his eyes off the recorder. Because they were reported missing. Richard swallowed hard. A thin line of perspiration formed beneath his collar despite the cool air circulating through the ballroom. Investors who had surrounded him earlier quietly drifted away, leaving an empty circle around him that seemed wider with every passing second. Captain Ramirez connected the recorder to a small military speaker included in the evidence case. A low electronic hum filled the silence. Static crackled through the ballroom. Naomi slowly closed her eyes. She recognized the sound instantly. Desert wind. Rotor blades. engines idling in the distance. Then Captain Donovan's younger voice emerged through the static. Mission log. Convoy 7. Sergeant Naomi Brooks has requested immediate inspection of hydraulic pressure before departure. The room froze. Hayes never moved. Donovan continued. Recommendation denied by civilian contractor. Departure authorized. Richard's breathing caught. Naomi remained perfectly still. The recording continued. Sergeant Brooks insists the failure is mechanical, not operator error. I am documenting her warning in case. The audio broke beneath a burst of static. Then another voice interrupted. Calm. Firm. Naomi's own. If we move these vehicles now, someone is not coming home. No one in the ballroom breathed. The words seemed to hang beneath the chandeliers long after the recording fell silent. Hayes lowered his head. Several veterans quietly wiped at their eyes. An elderly colonel removed his service pin and held it tightly in his palm. Richard opened his mouth, searching for an explanation that refused to come. The recording, he whispered. It could be edited. Even he did not believe the words. Hayes slowly turned toward him. This recorder has remained under federal seal for 20 years. The general's voice stayed calm, but every syllable carried the weight of judgment. No one touched it. Richard looked around desperately. The reporters who had once surrounded him were now focused entirely on Naomi. Investors avoided his eyes. Even the security officers no longer stood near him. Naomi finally spoke, not to Richard, but to the room itself. I never wanted anyone blamed. Her voice trembled for the first time that evening. I only wanted them to remember the truth. The silence that followed felt heavier than every accusation spoken before it. Then Captain Ramirez carefully unfolded the final sheet resting beneath the recorder. His expression changed instantly. He looked at Hayes, then at Naomi, unable to speak. Hayes frowned. Captain? Ramirez slowly turned the page toward them. At the bottom, beneath Captain Donovan's final signature, was a handwritten sentence added just hours before the convoy departed. Hayes read it once, then looked up at Naomi with disbelief filling his eyes. Sergeant Brooks, he said quietly, you were never supposed to survive that mission. The words settled over the ballroom with the weight of a lifetime. You were never supposed to survive that mission. No one moved. The soft hum of the ventilation system seemed impossibly loud beneath the silence. Naomi did not answer immediately. She simply looked at the faded page in General Hayes's hands, her eyes reflecting the cold chandelier light. The memories she had buried for 20 years returned without warning. She remembered Captain Donovan smiling before the convoy rolled out. She remembered him pressing a folded map into her hand and quietly saying, If anything goes wrong, keep moving. At the time, she had thought he was trying to encourage a young medic. Now she understood he had known far more than he ever admitted. Around the ballroom, veterans lowered their heads one after another. A retired sergeant slowly removed his service ribbon and pressed it against his chest. The room no longer looked at Naomi with curiosity. They looked at her with the quiet respect reserved for someone who had carried an invisible burden for decades without asking anyone to notice. Richard Whitmore stood alone near the front table. The investors who had once crowded around him had stepped away. Their eyes no longer searched his face for leadership. They searched it for answers he could no longer provide. His breathing had become shallow. The crystal glass in his hand trembled until he quietly placed it on the table before it slipped from his fingers. General Hayes closed the classified file with deliberate care. Sergeant Brooks, he said softly, the official record failed you. Naomi shook her head almost immediately. It failed all of them. She glanced toward the weathered photograph of the convoy. The families waited years believing the wrong story. Her voice never rose. That calm dignity seemed to affect the room more deeply than any speech could have. A young television producer silently lowered her headset. An elderly widow standing beside the veterans wiped away a tear she had hidden for years. Captain Ramirez looked at Naomi differently now. Not as someone standing before history, but as someone who had quietly become part of it. Richard finally took one hesitant step forward. Every eye followed him. The confident businessman who had mocked Naomi at the entrance was gone. In his place stood a man visibly carrying the weight of every careless word he had spoken only an hour earlier. He stopped several feet away from her. "Sergeant Brooks." His voice almost failed him. Naomi met his eyes without anger. He looked away first. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." The admission barely rose above a whisper, yet it spread through the ballroom more powerfully than applause ever could. Naomi answered after a long pause. "You were not the first." Richard closed his eyes. The sentence landed with quiet mercy instead of condemnation, making the shame on his face even harder to watch. General Hayes stepped beside Naomi. Without announcing it or calling for attention, he slowly raised his hand in a flawless military salute. Captain Ramirez followed instantly. Then the elderly veterans. Then every active service member in the room. One after another, rows of raised hands filled the ballroom in complete silence. No one instructed them. No one applauded. Only the faint clicking of phone cameras documented a moment that words could never fully capture. Naomi stood motionless, overwhelmed but composed. After a few seconds, she slowly returned the salute. Tears shimmered in several eyes throughout the room, yet no one spoke. The silence itself had become the tribute. Hayes lowered his hand and carefully picked up the tarnished medal that had waited 20 years for its rightful owner. He held it gently between both hands before looking at Naomi once more. "This belongs to you," he said. Naomi looked at the medal, then toward the photograph of Captain Donovan. Her fingers never reached for it. "Not yet," she whispered. The unexpected answer stopped everyone again. Hayes frowned slightly. "Why not?" Naomi drew one slow breath. "Because there is still one promise I have not kept to the man who earned it beside me." The medal rested quietly in General Hayes's open hands, its worn silver catching the last glow of the chandeliers. No one reached for it. No one hurried the silence. Naomi Brooks looked past the medal toward the weathered photograph of Captain Donovan, and for a long moment the ballroom faded into nothing more than distant breathing and the faint hum of the air above. "He promised every family he would bring their sons home," she said softly. "He kept that promise longer than anyone remembers." Her voice never shook. It simply carried through the room with the calm certainty of someone who had already made peace with her own pain. General Hayes slowly lowered the medal. "Then tell us how we honor him." Naomi stepped closer, not toward the stage, but toward the folded American flag standing beside it. She rested two fingers gently against the polished wooden staff. "By telling the truth. All of it." No applause followed. Only lowered heads. Captain Ramirez carefully gathered the classified files, placing Captain Donovan's recorder beside them with quiet respect, as though returning a soldier's voice to history. An elderly veteran who had remained silent throughout the ceremony walked toward Naomi. His hands trembled with age as he removed his own campaign ribbon and slipped it into her palm. "I cannot change yesterday," he whispered, "but I can thank you today." Naomi closed his fingers back around the ribbon. "Keep it," she replied with a gentle smile. "Wear it for the friends who cannot." Tears filled the old man's eyes as he nodded. Around the ballroom, veterans slowly straightened their jackets. One after another, they stood a little taller. Richard Whitmore remained where he was, surrounded now only by empty space. The investors who had once waited for his approval quietly walked past him without a word. Several paused instead beside Naomi, offering simple handshakes, silent nods, or nothing more than grateful eyes. Richard watched every one of them. For the first time in years, status could not help him. Money could not interrupt the truth. He approached Naomi carefully, stopping at a respectful distance. "There is nothing I can say that fixes this." Naomi looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No." The word was honest, not cruel. Richard lowered his eyes. "Then I will spend the rest of my life trying anyway." She gave the smallest nod, accepting neither victory nor revenge, only the possibility that people could become better than the moment they were judged by. General Hayes picked up the medal once more. This time Naomi accepted it. Not with triumph, but with both hands, as though receiving something that belonged to many more people than herself. Hayes stepped back exactly 1 pace. Then, in complete silence, he raised the first salute. Captain Ramirez followed. Every veteran followed. Even civilians who did not know the proper form instinctively placed a hand over their hearts. The phone cameras that had recorded humiliation at the beginning of the evening slowly lowered. Some moments, everyone seemed to understand, were meant to be witnessed instead of captured. Outside, the setting sun poured warm amber light through the ballroom windows, replacing the cold reflections that had filled the room all evening. The silver medal glowed softly against Naomi's worn jacket, no brighter than before, yet somehow entirely different. She turned toward the exit without another speech. Her footsteps echoed gently across the marble floor. No one tried to stop her. No one walked ahead of her. They simply made room. As the doors opened, a cool evening breeze carried in the distant sound of a military bugle. Naomi paused only once, glancing back at the rows of silent faces now standing in respect instead of judgment. Then she walked into the fading light, and behind her, General Hayes remained motionless, his salute unbroken until the doors closed and only the quiet dignity she left behind remained in the room.